Welcome to the endowment. I'm Nadia Duke. I'm a vice president here at the NED, and I'd like to welcome you all here today for this, what I hope is going to be, and I know is going to be a very interesting session. We have, today's event is African state legislatures and democratic development, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. So we're covering a broad territory. I'd like to thank the American Political Science Association and also American University's Comparative and Regional Studies program for very kindly co-sponsoring with us today. You have a lot of information in your handouts already, but just to remind you that this event really is looking at information and materials that emerged out of a project that was funded by NED in the grant awarded to Landmark University, Nigeria. It coordinated research by African and US academics on state legislatures in Africa. This is, I am told that this is an area that is not very well researched, but as we move forward with democratization on the continent, this is a very crucial area that really needs to be explored in order for processes to move forward. So we very much look forward to hearing what conclusions this program came to today. All of NED's partners have programs in Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. The Political Party Institutes, IRI and NDI, also our Labour Institute, Solidarity Centre, and Centre for International Private Enterprise. So we're all eagerly awaiting to hear more about the conclusions that you all came to. One small announcement. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum, which is @ThinkDemocracy, or the endowment, which is @NEDDemocracy, and also Carl LeVan, one of our speakers, and he's @Dev4Security, which is DEV, the number 4 security. And the event is also being live streamed at ned.org events. Our moderator today will be Ambassador Robin Saunders. Just to give you a brief introduction to her. Ambassador Saunders is the CEO of the Feeds Advocacy Initiative, and I have here owns Feds LLC. This is an institution that works on economic development and business strategies for Africa. She has served as US Ambassador to Nigeria and Republic of Congo, and has served twice as Africa Director at the National Security Council, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Program, and also Nigeria's National Defense College. Her business expertise lies in the areas of agriculture, aviation security, housing, information technology, small and medium enterprises, and health systems. And also, she is a strong academic and is an adjunct professor at Robert Morris University. Before I actually hand over the floor to Ambassador Saunders, I would like to invite from our co-sponsors from APSA, the Associate Program Director, Betsy Super, who will make a couple of remarks before we start, and then we'll hand over to Ambassador Saunders.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I just wanted to talk very briefly about the Africa workshops that we sponsor at the American Political Science Association and how that relates to what we're going to hear today. So the Africa Workshops is a multi-year initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation, which aims to bring together scholars from the US and across sub-Saharan Africa for 2 to 3 weeks of intense academic work, so seminars, talks, revisions on current research projects, and learning a little bit about some professional development opportunities. And when the program was first designed, the idea was not just to work with scholars who were in sub-Saharan Africa, but try and really see some long-term international collaborations through the incorporation of US-based academics as well. We're now in our 7th year, and workshops have focused on themes varying from political participation to distributive goods and distributive politics, gender and politics, religion and politics in the state, and also on elections and electoral participation. So we've had over 150 scholars who participated to date. And Carl and Joseph are two of those scholars. Carl co-led the 2011 workshop on Representation Reconsidered, Ethnic Politics and Africa's Governance Institutions in Comparative Perspective, and Joseph was a fellow who participated in that workshop. Now, as I understand it, and I did just double check with Carl to make sure this was correct, this was the beginning of a beautiful scholarly relationship. And I count among their collaborations at least one conference in Nigeria, a prior meeting in DC, planned panels at APS's annual meeting, this event here today, and an edited volume on legislatures, which you can read about as well as also 2 grants, one from the NED and then also one from APSA, publication grant for the book. And as an added value contribution from our end, the edited volume also includes contributions from other Africa Workshop alumni. So I can't think of a clearer example of collaboration which has spun out from one particular event and workshop. Now, Carl and Joseph's work is important to my mind, not just because as a program officer it's always edifying to see the types of the outcomes that you hope to see develop, but also because they really hit the sweet spot of research which is academically important and relevant to real-world outcomes. So whether you were looking at the global north or the global south, legislatures are at the center of almost every major contemporary challenge, whether that's adequate representation and democratic voice, taxes and distributive goods, coping with environmental damage, immigration, economic inequality, or almost any other problem that you can think about today. And yet, curiously, as we've heard already, and I'm sure we'll hear more about, legislatures frequently receive less attention than executive politics or global governance. But if we are to meet these challenges, then we need to know, and it would be awfully helpful to know more about legislatures. So this is precisely what I hope we can all benefit from today's talk, whether in academics or in practice. And before I hand over, I'll just put a very brief plug in for anyone who is interested. Tomorrow we're having a small roundtable on international collaborations, international research collaborations, challenges and opportunities. That's 4:30 p.m. at the American Political Science Association, and I'm happy to tell you more about that afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss this very, very key issue regarding the forward movement of democracy on the continent. I think, as most of you know, there are 54 countries on the continent. They have 26 bicameral legislatures and 30 unicameral legislatures, with South Sudan being one of the newest, and Kenya transitioning from a unicameral system to a bicameral system as a result of its constitution. But what's far greater and far more important is the number of subnational legislatures, and we'll be looking at that and hearing about that today. One would argue that they have even a bigger role in the forward movement of democracy on the continent. A couple of key facts I think you want to keep in mind as you're listening to the presentations this morning. Africa today has 1.2 billion people, of which 60% of that is under the age of 19. By 2050, reportedly, according to Population Research Bureau, the continent's population will be 2.4 billion people, same figure of percentage of people under the age of at least 25. So what does that mean for political and social sector reform? What does that mean for change? How do we get there? Legislatures play a huge part of that, and I would argue that subnational legislatures even play a greater part of that. Today, our panel will highlight their collaborative research. You've already heard the countries, but I'll repeat them for you. They are Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. They're all powerhouse nations, as we all recognize. They all struggle with a variety of social, economic, and political challenges, particularly wealth inequality, with South Africa at the top of that list for sub-Saharan Africa. A couple of things I want to highlight. some of the criticisms of legislatures, even the subnational ones on the continent, is that they have not played their transformative role. And we'll hear today whether or not that's true or not. They have struggled with crafting legislation that really has an impact on the ground. They struggle with constituent outreach. A lot of them don't even have constituent offices, and they struggle with sustainability. Our panel today are three distinguished academics and presenters. Before I introduce them, when we move straight to them, let me just remind everyone to either put your cell phone on mute or vibrate so that we don't have that interruption. The three presenters, the first one will be Professor Fashagba from Landmark University in Kwara State, Nigeria, who will highlight the research from Nigeria, followed by Professor Carl Levin from American University, who will present the research from Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa, and Professor Mozaffar from Bridgewater State in Massachusetts will provide some feedback on our discussion, and he will also highlight his work on African state legislatures. Each presenter will have about 20 minutes to make their presentations. We will wrap up and then move to question and answers. I will take questions in groups of three. Please make sure you state your name, your affiliation, and actually make a question instead of a commentary. With that, I will begin with Professor Fashagba, who will highlight his research from Nigeria. Thank you, Professor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am here to present the report of the three papers written and presented by those who work on Nigeria. The three papers, the title of the first paper is Taxation and Determinants of Legislative Representation in Africa, Nigeria as a Case Study. The second paper is Executive Dominance, Party Control, and State Legislature in Nigeria, evidence from 3 states in the Northwest Geopolitical Zone. And the last one, Subnational Legislatures and National Governing Institutions in Nigeria. The first paper examined the relationship between legislature and constituency. The second paper examined the relationship between executive and legislature at the subnational level. And the last paper examined the relationship between the legislature and national institutions, subnational legislature and national governing institutions in Nigeria. We observed that increasingly most of the new democracies in Africa are moving in the direction of decentralization. And if countries are moving in the direction of decentralization with constitutional reform to strengthen local democracy or subnational democracy, to what extent has this in reality translate into strong subnational institutions? And we essentially examine the legislatures at the subnational level. States have moved in the direction of decentralization. And if they are moving in the direction of decentralization, we expect that that will translate to the strengthening of the subnational institutions. And if constitutional design have been made to strengthen subnational institutions, are they allowed in real time, in reality, by the institutions at the center to function according to the provisions of the Constitution? This is the key issue that most of the papers on Nigeria examined, looking at it from the 3 dimensions I have just highlighted. The 1999 Constitution of Nigeria decentralized power, giving the center its power, and the subnational institutions, the legislature, parallel institutions at the subnational level, having their own independent power. They are autonomous in terms of organizing their institutions and in terms of functions given to them by the Constitution. So we're interested in examining the extent to which these subnational institutions are responsive to the constituent one, the extent to which they are able to assert themselves in their relationship, the legislature specifically is able to assert its power in relationship with the executive, and the extent to which is able to enjoy its independence as provided by the Constitution against the central institutions. For the first paper written by Elemo on taxation and determinant of legislative representation in Africa, Nigeria as a case study, the question that interested her was, how does reliance on different forms of public revenue sources influence individual elected officers? She worked on taxation to see the extent to which tax-dependent states in Nigeria are responsive to their constituents. The second paper examined the phenomenon of executive dominance, party control, and subordination of the legislature at the state level. And while the last one examined the extent to which the subnational legislature have been able to operate within the functional, operational, and institutional autonomy granted them by the Constitution without interference from the national institutions. All the three writers, researchers, gather data from the secondary and primary sources. And let me go straight to their findings without wasting your time. Elemo observes in her paper that the southern states generate more revenue from tax than the northern states. Hence, the north is more dependent on oil income in Nigeria. According to her, there's a positive relationship between tax reliance and legislators from those states providing prioritizing representation and constituency preferences. In her paper, she observed that states that are dependent on tax are more responsive to constituent needs and priority. States that generate more tax, according to her, relate more with their constituents, and they are driven by constituency interest in the policy they pursued in the legislature. But states that are less dependent on tax, that depend on federal transfer, are not responsive at the same level with states that are dependent on tax. Perhaps that suggests that states that are dependent on tax, because they have to be accountable to the taxpayers, they have to be responsive to the views, interests, opinions of those that are paying taxes. And states that are not dependent on taxes are less responsive to their constituents. Further, she observed that states that are dependent on tax in Nigeria spend more time performing constituency services. States that are dependent on tax or that generate more of their, more revenue from tax than others depend or perform more of constituency service, unlike states that depend on transfer from the center to run their affairs. In her conclusions, she observed that tax appears to translate to better representation. Tax appears to translate to better representation. That is, states that are generating more resources from tax provide more representation for their constituencies than states that depend on federal transfer. The second paper, which examined the relationship between legislature and the executive, the writer observed that almost all the states in Nigeria, the executive, that is the governor, the state governor dominates the political process in virtually all the states of the federation, that the executive, the governor, dominate the political process. And according to him, this was so because the governors control the ruling party at the state level. Under the Nigeria's arrangement, the governor is the de facto leader of the party at the state level. So the governor controls the party structure, sometimes appointing the leaders of the party. So by the time he appoints the leader, he takes charge of the affairs of the party. The governor presides over a huge resources, over a very huge resources in Nigeria. The state governors, once they receive their allocation, they control the allocation. In fact, they decide what goes to the legislature as well. So as a result of this, they are very powerful to the extent that they are able to control the legislature. Further, he observed that the grip of the governors on the state legislatures was possible because most of the state legislatures in Nigeria are controlled by one party. Most of the state legislatures are one-party dominant. So we have very few that we have some few opposition members in the state legislature. Further, he observed that most of the state legislators depend on the governors, especially those seeking re-election. They depend on the governors for funding of their electioneering campaign activities. And when the governors fund their electioneering campaign activities, ultimately the governor will control them when they emerge as legislators, because they have submitted themselves to be funded by the governor, so he who pays the price dictates the tone. He observed that in most of the state legislatures, any member that is daring enough to challenge the governor often face sanction. In the few legislatures where we have some pocket of members that are from opposition parties, they have succeeded in putting the governors on their toes because they are able to challenge those that do not belong to the same ruling party at the state level have been able to challenge the governor. That is on executive legislature relations at the subnational level in Nigeria. The third paper that examined the subnational legislature and national institutions observed that the federal government, especially the presidency, although very strong at the national level, but when it comes to relationship between the presidency and the subnational legislature, the president becomes very weak because the governor is in between and the governor takes charge at that level. We administer a questionnaire to actually find out from legislators about their relationship with the center and the governor. And we observe that most of the legislators, state legislators, observe that if they oppose the president at the national level on any policy issue, they stand to be re-elected. The chances of re-election will still be high. But if they oppose the governor on any policy issue, that may threaten their re-election opportunity. And we discovered that this holds for those states controlled even by the national ruling party at the state level, as well as those controlled by the opposition parties. That is, the PDP, the People's Democratic Party is the ruling party at the national level. And state controls by PDP, even at the subnational level. If they oppose the president, they may go scot-free. But if they oppose their governor, who is also from the same party, they may be sanctioned, denied re-election ticket. But for this, for also those in the opposition parties, we have opposition party ruling some states in Nigeria, a number of states under them. If they oppose the president also on any major policy issue, but support their governor, that will not attract any major sanction. The governor is the major factor at the state level. Thank you. The governors at the state level have greater role, therefore, on legislative recruitment and career advancement of state legislators than those at the center. The governors at the state level have major role in the career advancement, and we observe this in different states. For example, in Borno State in 2007, the speaker was pliant to the governor, so when he was re-elected, the governor ensured that he was returned as the speaker the second time. In Niger State, the governor himself was personally present in the state legislature in 2003 to ensure that the speaker returned as speaker for another 4 years. In Ondo State, in 2010, the speaker that was not subservient to the governor was removed and replaced by somebody who was not pliant. The same thing also happened in Edo State. And recently, in January this year, because of the mass defection that happened in some of the state legislatures in Nigeria, the Speaker of Kano State Assembly was forced to resign because he did not defect to a new party formed recently, All Progressive Congress. About 32 members defected to the party. The Speaker did not defect with them, so he was forced to resign. About 32 members of the member of PDP, because of there was internal implosion of PDP, so many members defected recently. So the governor defected, and about 32 members defected, but the speaker refused to defect, so he was forced to resign and replaced. So the career advancement, in terms of political recruitment and career advancement, the governor played a very key role. We observe that the state assemblies where the federal government have been able to use this legislature against the executive were states in which there was a conflict between the state legislature and the executive. This happened, for example, in Oyo State in 2006. In 2006, because there was a crack between the executive and the legislature, the president was able to use the state assembly to impeach the governor, although the Supreme Court of Nigeria reversed the decision because the procedure was unconstitutional in the sense that the requirement for impeachment was 2/3 majority of members. Out of 32 members, only 18 members impeached the governor. So because of the unconstitutionality of the procedure, the Supreme Court reversed the decision and the governor was reinstated. In other instances in which the presidency or the national institutions have been able to influence state legislature was by coercion. This happened in Bayelsa State in 2006 and in Plateau State in 2005 when the governor was impeached by 7 out of 24 members. Only 7 members gathered together. The federal government used the EFCC to harass them, and ultimately they succumbed to the federal government, even though their number was not enough. They still went ahead to impeach the governor, but the Supreme Court also reversed this.
Professor, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. So, the summary of the whole thing is that the governors at the state level have very firm grip on the subnational assemblies in Nigeria. And in terms of legislature-constituency relation, I think the degree of tax generated by the state vis-a-vis the income of the state determines the extent to which the legislatures are responsive to their constituents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very enlightening presentation. I've been fascinated to hear the taxation part because I know that taxation is a struggle in Nigeria. Collecting taxes is really a struggle, and certainly your comments on the governors I know quite well because they do determine where the money goes in their states and which LGAs that they will support and represent in a more fair manner. Turning now to Dr. LeVan from American University. He will present the collaborative research findings on Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Dr. LeVan.
Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to NED for organizing this event, hosting us, and frankly taking a chance on this project and allowing our collaboration to go forward and hopefully flourish. I think, or maybe it's flourishing but hasn't quite blossomed, so hopefully spring will come soon in political science. And I also want to underscore the incredible value of the APSA's Africa workshops, the American Political Science Association. And the workshops are great because they're designed to foster precisely this kind of relationship and collaboration, and they were explicitly designed to encourage collaboration between American scholars and African scholars as equals. So when I was involved with the workshop, there were 2 African scholars who we partnered with and another American scholar that I partnered with, and the 4 of us had to come together and collectively make tough decisions. What are we going to do for 2 weeks? What do we want people to read? And what would really add to the state of political science in Africa? And it was a really exciting opportunity. I'm very grateful that APSA has continued to value that project. And I also want to thank Landmark University for hosting this seminar that was referred to, that was the main thrust of our NED grant. The seminar took place in January. And what I want to do is outline the core themes of that conference and then reflect generally about some of the tensions and interesting arguments that we had over the course of 2 or 3 days, and then go through quickly some of the key findings from the individual papers that have been referenced. There were 3 broad themes that we wanted people to think about. One, which was institutional independence or autonomy. 2, the incentives for reform at the subnational level. And 3, institutional capacity. And so what we mean by incentives for reform, that's part of our hook to democratization. There are some interesting and important cases from Latin America, notably Mexico, where when democratization was playing out very, very slowly at the national level, strategists turned to the states, politicians turned to the states, and even to the mayoral level to create new competitions. We wanted to see if that was happening maybe in Africa or if that was not quite relevant. With regard to capacity, that very quickly became, I think, our dominant theme, perhaps, of those 3 themes. And we really wanted to get the contributors and researchers to think more than about simply the level of education or the years of previous political experience that subnational politicians might be bringing to their office. So with regard to that, there were a couple of things we wanted them to think about. And we provided a concept paper to promote a cohesive dialogue. One was how much autonomy within the party system do these politicians have? Politicians running for local government or for state-level government, how much control does the party actually have at the state or provincial level over who gets on the ballot? Professor Fashagba gave a very compelling and problematic summary of Nigeria. 2, what's the projected career path of politicians? That is, if you serve in local government, what do you do next? Do you aspire to become a member of the National Assembly? Do you aspire to become a party official? Or do you aspire to cash in on your new connections in order to get some sort of benefits in the private sector? And that's important because it's really hard to get inside the minds of politicians. But if you think about their career paths, what do they aspire to do and what do they actually do once they finish, then you can infer some really key information about what's actually happening in the political system and the sort of incentives and disincentives they face. 3, internal revenue effort. And so this was one of the key findings from the Elemo paper that Fashagba talked about. And that is where the federal government has little discretion in determining state allocations, how does this affect the political authority of state executives? And then also just in cases like Nigeria's, you have the federal government accruing most of the revenue and then simply giving grants to states. Yet, as Elemo's paper discovered and explained, there are several very interesting, very important states which reveal that there's a great deal of diversity, a surprising level of diversity across Nigeria, especially in recent years, in internal tax generation. And this presents a puzzle. If the states are literally getting billions of dollars a year in oil money, why would you bother taxing anybody? So it raises very interesting questions about the political logic and political strategy. We asked people with regard to capacity to think about judicial enforcement. That is, if states perhaps have some sort of authority on paper, or if local government officials have some sort of independence on paper, when do they turn to the courts, and what role do the courts play? Are the courts simply co-opted institutions, or are they sometimes served as useful mediators? This turns out to be very interesting in the Kenyan case. Last is the question of institutional congruence, and that is, with regard to capacity, is there a good deal of variation at state or provincial level structure of politics, or do they simply mirror what comes from the center? Ethiopia, unsurprisingly, turned out to be the most dramatic example of a place where the state at the provincial level, the political institutions almost exactly mirror the federal institutions. And one of the great insights, I think, of Solomon Gofie's paper is to explain how that happened, why that's happened, and he advances a novel argument about why that has been sustained. So now just a few reflections on the seminar in January, now that I've given you a little bit of background about the overall themes and some of the concepts that we put together in order to go forward in commissioning the papers. One thing we, of course, encountered is that the contributors, the essayists, had to make some tough choices about what to focus on, given all of these ideas and these 5 possible ways of examining capacity that I just mentioned. So the good news is that this led to some really interesting intersections, such as the role of the courts in South Africa at the provincial level being used to take on the African National Congress's hegemony, the ANC hegemony. Also, some emergent thinking about institutions and institutionalism. Fashagba and I, and Professor Mozaffar also, were all political scientists. And one of the trends in political science over the last 10 or 15 years has been more and more and more surveys, for example. And so this has given us a great deal of insight about attitudes, but there's also some disadvantages to that. There's been a tremendous focus on voting behavior. And Solomon Gofie had a very creative burst and insight where he said, I don't want to do that for Ethiopia. So what he did was he looked at discourse, and he did a communicative analysis and links his analysis of Ethiopian politics at the provincial level to an emerging discursive institutionalism. So rather than looking at voting behavior, rather than simply doing polling, he looks at the rhetoric of politics and the role that that plays in enforcing conformity. Another theme that emerged at the seminar in January in Nigeria was a very interesting argument among the scholars and among the broader participants in the audience about studying elite behavior and the virtues and benefits of studying elite behavior. Elemo and Oladejii Olaore both study elite behavior. That is, they're trying to figure out how politicians make strategic decisions about what the right thing to do is. And one of the things that emerged that was sort of surprising for us was some participants thought that they were apologizing for elite behavior. That is, that they were justifying this as sort of a norm and ignoring perhaps corrupt behavior behind the scenes and that sort of thing. And what Elemo and Olaore were both doing was we're saying we're not saying that what citizens do is uninteresting. We're not ignoring civil society. We're simply saying what goes into the thinking of politicians. With regard to Olaore, he was focusing on the use of SMS and polytexting technology to examine when and why politicians might use it. And for Elemo, as Professor Fashagba has pointed out, she was looking at how the level of taxation in different states across Nigeria shapes the kind of emphases that those politicians have in terms of their priorities. So it was very nice at the seminar and across the papers of the project to have different units of analysis as well. We have a comparison of legislators across countries. For example, in Olaore's paper, he interviews legislators in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and in Nigeria. So we have, within one essay, a comparative analysis. Secondly, we also have analysis across subnational legislatures within one country, as in the case of Nigeria, and the chapters on Kenya and Ethiopia. And then lastly, as a third unit of analysis, we also have, with the South Africa chapter, a focus primarily on just one province. So we can think about these subnational politics at three different levels, which I think is really exciting. An intellectual premise of the project that I think most of us agreed on was that we didn't simply want to depart from the idea that elites ignore institutions. That is, that the Constitution says one thing or the law says one thing and elites just do whatever they want. What we wanted to do was to think about the interactions of institutions, including the potential incongruities that may produce conflicting incentives for behavior, and that this leads to flawed political representation. That is, if the governors, for example, in Nigeria, as Fashagba outlined, are so powerful, then this interferes with the ability of citizens to actually choose the candidates that they want. Let me talk for a few minutes about each of the papers, just highlighting some of the interesting points that they raised from their findings, and then also the broader questions that I see them relating in terms of our own interests in democratization and in political reform in Africa. With regard to DG Olaore's paper, this is the paper on polytexting and SMS technology, he notes that 1/4 of Nigerians regularly use the internet, whereas in the other countries that he examined, Sierra Leone and Liberia, it's less than 3% of the population. Now, that data is a few years old, but that gives you a sense of a great deal of variation just within 3 countries that are all relatively close to one another. And one question is, how does this actually make polytexting SMS technology useful to politicians at all? And there's a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement, and one of the things that Olaore and I have been arguing about is whether this excitement is indeed naive, or if it's in fact warranted with regard to the use of technology to democratize. He focuses on one-way communication. So unlike many of the other projects that are coming out of the study of technology, he's not looking at the ability of civil society and citizens and voters to pressure politicians. He's focusing on elite behavior, and he's focusing on when and why and how do politicians use this technology to shape messages. So one of the contributions I think his paper makes is to give us some new information in 3 countries about technology as a tool of opinion shaping. So we tend to think of this and romanticize this technology often as something that's inherently grassroots upwards. And what's interesting about him is that in democratic/democratizing cases, he's thinking of this in terms of opinion shaping and tools from the elites on down. One of the big questions that I think it raises, when we do think of it in terms of two-way political communication, though, is that polytexting appears to be a symptom of decentralizing communications between citizens and politicians. So if If there have been other varieties of institutional reforms at the formal level, this has become a technological medium that is operated in parallel, that has decentralized communication. So no longer do elites have the kind of control over the discourse that they used to. I mean, the classic example of this was Daniel Lerner's experience in Balaghat, Turkey in 1953-54, where the chief was the only person in Balaghat, Turkey who had the radio in his hut. And so everyone would gather in his hut, and the chief would interpret the news for all the villagers. Well, the problem is that a few years later, lots of other people owned radios, and it became more and more difficult for the chief to dominate the interpretation of what the news was coming from Ankara. Solomon Gofie's paper on Ethiopia has a couple of main themes, and each of them, I think, engage the concepts that I mentioned in our terms of reference. And this paper also has some important original research, much of which he had to do, of course, discreetly in Ethiopia's climate. It starts off with a summary of the judiciary, the executive, and the civil service in the opening pages, and it sets up a key puzzle. He says, despite the appearance of strong subnational institutions, the center regularly encroaches on this authority. Now, remember what I said a few minutes ago. We didn't ask scholars to simply say elites can ignore institutions. We wanted them to say, how do they do this? Why do they do this? When do they not get away with this? And his argument is that traditional institutionalism can't really explain when this does or does not happen in Ethiopia. And this leads us to what he describes as a discourse of control. And that is, there's a relationship between discourse and identity. This plays out in a couple of different ways. One is in the naming of the very provinces across Ethiopia. Typically within the political science literature, in diverse heterogeneous societies, you're attempting to avoid reinforcing discrete identities, ethnic cleavages, and so forth. And Ethiopia, for the most part, in most of its provinces, does almost the opposite, and it has this effect of not interfering with a strong national identity, but it has led to exclusionary politics within some of those regions. So in other words, it's been fairly productive in terms of the national identity, but he says one of the things we haven't noticed in Ethiopia is that within the provinces and the Gofie system within Ethiopia, that there is an exclusionary politics and debate within that. Another term of art that's embraced by the Ethiopian government is the idea of a developmental army. And he argues that this is used to weaken state-society relations and enable the state to dominate the rhetoric about the role of development and militarizing, at least in rhetoric, the way that this implements political changes. And very quickly, we found out, shortly after we commissioned this essay from him, we had a conversation about post-Melis Ethiopia. And one of the important findings, I think, from the paper is he says there is no post-Melis Ethiopia. That the idea of a post-Melis politics is deliberately and entirely absent from the discourse in Ethiopia. So instead what we have is an ongoing revolutionary discourse of three tiers: peace, development, and democracy, which has been key to the EPRDF, the ruling juntas, the ruling cliques governing strategy. So, so this is a really important and interesting paper, and we're very excited about the thread that he weaves from different electoral moments and the continuity in the discourse that's been used to maintain a great deal of control over the provinces as potential instruments of political reform. In Westen Shlaho's paper on Kenya, we asked him to think about the 2010 de-evolution, Kenya's new constitution in 2010, which, by the way, There was a fantastic event here in the NED a few years ago with 2 separate panels about Kenya's political reform, one panel of politicians and one panel of civil society, and you can't even imagine the gap in the interpretation of what happened in 2010 between those 2 panels. So if you have time to go back and revisit that podcast or that event, I would encourage you to do so. Shlaho's paper departs from some of the familiar critiques that we have of Kenyan politics about patronage being at the center of politics, about the problem of marginalization because of highly politicized ethnicity, and these sorts of things. And also the idea of regions as being a source of resources rather than a place to deliver public goods. That is, that they are places where the center is extracting goods and revenues rather than the center seeing them as a place to where goods should be provided. And so one of the things that he looks at is the constituency development funds, the CDFs, which were supposed to start to change this relationship. Secondly, he looks at the question of de-evolution, and he uses this phrase that there's been a glamour of de-evolution in Kenya, that de-evolution was supposed to do all the things that decentralization literature talks about, such as fragmenting authority in a productive way, making government more responsive and efficient, bringing government closer to the people, diffusing political attentions, all these sorts of things. But he says there's a glamour surrounding this de-evolution. So he asks, were the 2010 reforms, the creation of counties for the first time in Kenya, were they, he says, a ray of hope, or were they a mirage? And the key constituent assemblies that he looks at are the MCAs. And this presented a conceptual problem for our broader framework, which for us is to say, do we want to consider these conceptual assemblies as legislatures at all? And we decided we very much want to, even though they're not precisely legislatures in the traditional sense. They don't show up, for example, in comparisons of federal systems. But they are incubators of federal experiments in Africa. And so we think that this is a really important reason to include Kenya's MCAs among these institutional experiments. So these newly created counties were supposed to differ from Kenya's historical provincial administrations, which were the products of Kenya's dominant presidents in the post-nationalist period. But he said President Kibaki appointed county commissioners before he left office in 2010, which is a power that formally he didn't have really at all. So he was recreating the provincial administration that Kenyans had long complained about as being a colonial hangover. This, he says, was deliberately an effort to weaken de-evolution. With regard to the CDFs, the constituency development funds, he says, you know, some were successful. And where they were successful, he says that there's an empirical correlation between successful CDFs, constituency funds, and demand for decentralization. So where constituency services had been strongest was also where we saw the most coherent and strongest demands for decentralization. That, I think, is an interesting and important insight and encourages us to not think about political reform and these sort of institutional trends in isolation. We really have to think about them in an integrated way. On the downside, he says that the creation of MCAs in many important cases has decentralized corruption. So rather than fragmenting political power, it's just created new decentralized centers of corruption. He points to examples where county officials furnished private homes, bought luxury cars, immediately and successfully demanded large salary increases, and provides empirical evidence that the number of civil service positions went up very, very quickly because the county officials wanted to be able to give rents and these new county official positions to new civil servants.
2 minutes, Professor. Okay,
great. What was the top case he suggests for these countries to learn, for these officials to learn from? They all wanted to do study missions to Rwanda. And he says this is absurd because Rwanda is the perfect example of centralization, not decentralization, yet it was at the top of their list. Just a few interesting things about the Mamogale paper on South Africa. This is the paper, as I said, that focuses on one specific province, the Limpopo provincial legislature. And he interviewed 25 members of the legislature and staff and departs from a similar understanding of the African Legislatures project that Professor Mozaffar is going to talk about in a moment, and that he agrees that legislatures constantly face collective action problems. They're constantly trying to agree on interpretations of what the national public good is, and same thing at the provincial level, and this is in contrast to executives. He also departs from a key insight from Ming Singh's important research a few years ago that says what we know about legislatures around the world is that strong legislatures in presidential systems are one of our best checks against military coups and one of our best guarantors of political stability, giving us a really strong rationale for why we need strong legislatures at a number of levels. I'm winding down. So key findings, even with the dominant ANC, he says there's lots of factionalization and polarization at the provincial level, and that the courts have played a constructive role, especially in Limpopo. And as we speak, there's a very important judicial battle fighting out along those lines because the provinces in South Africa had to fight to get their provincial legislature budgets approved, and it's unclear in the Constitution or in the law whether they have the authority to do so. Lastly, with regard to career paths, as you recall, one of our key frames for the conceptual framework, he says that he concludes that working with the party is unfortunately seen as a better job than actually running for local office in South Africa. So what the opposition, he says, probably needs to do is to generate more incentives to keep senior legislators in office rather than having them jump ship and go into the ministries, and to have those more localized and lower level positions remain attractive.
Thank you very much. Now we will turn to Professor Mozaffar, who will talk about his work on African state legislatures, but also provide a little bit of feedback on some of the discourse that we've heard today. It's interesting to listen to the two previous presenters and where some of the synergies are. I'm listening to the MDAs, and I'm listening and I'm hearing on the Nigeria side the LGAs, which I hope you will talk about in the Q&A session so that people really understand how that breaks down in Nigeria. Professor, you have 20 minutes, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, I've been asked to move over here because I'm going to be using PowerPoint as kind of my way of getting everybody stretching out at the, at the podium. Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I am not a stranger to Washington. If you read my bio, I've been working as a consultant to USAID for a number of years since the early 90s. I see a lot of faces here. Most of you are very young or to remember this. I see all the usual agencies, but the faces are different except a few friends and colleagues. So thank you for showing up. I also worked, just to give you some background, as a full-time diplomacy fellow at USAID, sitting in the what we like to call the bowels of the beast in the Reagan building. And I'm also familiar with NED. It was very good work. So what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit more broadly about these papers. Let me recommend these papers to you. The papers are still working through revisions. I've read the earlier draft. I look forward to reading the revised and the final versions. I have certainly self-interest in pushing this because this really is pioneering work. And as somewhat of a self-serving comment, just as an African legislature project was. And the reason when we started doing that project many, many moons ago, people looked at us and said, what exactly are we doing? Well, we started out with 18 legislatures, and my last slide will show you we collected a lot of data. Nobody has done that. So what we did, not only create a framework, which I will talk about for the context of this project that Carl and Joseph are involved in, but we also created a research design and approach of how to think and study legislatures by blending something very unique which American academics don't do, and that is blending high-powered academic research with policy implications. And between the three of us, the late Joel Barkin, myself, and Bob Mattis, the three co-principal investigators, over a nice bottle of wine in one of the wineries in Cape Town, we calculated the number of years, wonderful place to work in Cape Town, by the way, exactly how we came about doing this practical policy work. And between the three of us, we realized we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90 years of policy experience, and we are also high-powered political scientists and academics. So that work established the baseline, and this work really picks up on this. So it is very gratifying to see how this is progressing, and there are donors here. So let me suggest to you folks, you really need to pay attention to legislatures at the subnational level, because I would say over the next 10, 15, 20 years, this is where the action is. And if you want, and I am one of the few oddball American academics who is a big fan of USAID, although I'm also very critical, and other donors, but you are going to get a lot of bang for your buck. And in many cases, it's not going to be that many, all that big amount of bucks. So let me tell you why I think this is an important book. This remains the first analytically systematic, conceptually, theoretically, methodologically, policy-wise, what this book talks about remains the first attempt to study subnational legislatures. And here a reference Alp is a nice sequel to Alp, and I think this will, I hope this will not have a short shelf life. It should have a long shelf life, and this is also a message I'm really deliberately sending to NED, to all the donors who are in this audience. And I know we academics think this is important, otherwise we wouldn't be spending this much time doing it. So it is also empirically relevant on the ground. Why is this relevant? We all know for the last few years there's been a state retrenchment, decentralization, and the argument is that it brings greater accountability, which I'll talk about a little bit in some of these papers address and also don't address, bringing government closer to the people, if you will. It also as an attempt to remove the authoritarian overhang of the central government. And not only for Africa and for new democracies, emerging democracies, this remains one of these institutional legacies that is hopefully going away, but is going to take some time. And what I think substantively this project also does is an appropriate emphasis on the relationship between national power and subnational politics. So right off the bat, it puts this relationship up front and center as a starting point. And I think this is a very useful and important starting point. And it's also appropriate concern with capacity of subnational legislatures. And I will talk a little bit about capacity in a minute. That's why I have it listed here as legislative capacity. By the way, I'm standing at a side here, and there's reflection on the screen. Can you folks see the screen? Okay, because I'm getting the glare, so I'll read it off here. Now, in Carl's presentation, he talked about how to think about subnational legislatures. And one of the things I have learned over the years in teaching also, when speaking to my academic colleagues, use a lot of PowerPoint to keep everybody awake. And I like these PowerPoints, but it gives me a sense, and I just want to raise this issue, and I will raise a couple of other issues here, how we think about subnational legislatures. If you use the straightforward conception of how we think about systems, you got federal systems, unitary systems. In a federal system, a national legislature, this is the relationship here, and the state legislatures regulate local legislatures. The reason I have three of these arrows here is to indicate that there are three types of relationship that might exist between the federal legislatures and the state legislatures. One legislature, I'm going to go from right to left, and I'm going to show my American parochialism here. The right to left meaning is here when you see this the blue arrow going up. This is where the state legislatures possess all the power. and the federal government possesses very little power. No federal system operates like this. United States did operate like this, and it didn't work from 1776 to 1781. This was the Articles of Confederation, and we know what happened. The system simply fell apart until what I call the 55 white dead men got together in Philadelphia and designed our current Constitution, which is really our second Constitution. And thanks to Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Jay, they created a centralized federal system. Thanks to Rhode Island, part of the world where I live in, we now have the Bill of Rights, because without Rhode Island, we would not have the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights protects us from the tyranny of the federal government. And I raise that issue because the relationship between the federal government and the state government is an ongoing set of compromises, and our own history ought to tell us that. So that's one way to think about the relationship between federal and state governments. And what I think might be happening, and particularly in the Kenyan case, that we are looking at some very creative and politically very acrimonious relationship of redesigning the institution. I keep coming back to the political acrimonious. I'll keep coming back to. I like that. That's what democracy is all about. There is, and in the United States, we like to think of that a politician should be bipartisan, nonpartisan. I get very nervous because I know of only one kind of political system which exists on the basis of bipartisanship and nonpartisanship, and that is a dictatorship. Democracy is based on partisan conflict and acrimony. So what we are witnessing in Nigeria, in particular in South Africa, and it is good democratic process. We should not be afraid of it. I would say we would embrace it. And the institutional reform is always difficult to take care of. Now, on the yellow arrow, which goes from the national legislature to state legislature, this is where the state legislatures, national legislatures are very powerful. And this is what I think a lot of the subnational legislature is struggling with. And finally, you have this arrow with the local legislatures are controlled. But here, this is a pretty straightforward on the right side, on the unitary system where the national legislatures control local legislatures, because there is no middle buffer framework. And again, Kenya is a very good example of trying to create these kinds of buffers. And acting as a mediating institution. So I just want to raise this issue. This gets back to Carl's point of how to go about actually thinking through, and I think you will have to go back and do this when you write your introductory chapter. Okay, so now we'll get to some of the substantive aspect. How the book measures legislative capacity. Autonomy within party structure, projected career paths, internal revenue effort, these are the kinds of things that Carl has already talked about. So let me just raise some questions. Are these actual measures of capacity? Or what you folks are measuring, and you folks are doing a very good job of measuring these 5 factors. They may very well be factors that influence capacity. I just want to raise this issue for question and answers. I don't know, because of time. Okay, so how do we measure capacity? And this gets us back to a little bit of African Legislatures Project. Capacity is a measure of performance. And what we did in African Legislatures Project, we started from the back and move front to move forward. What we did was all legislatures perform 4 core functions: lawmaking, representation, constituency servicing, and oversight. These are the 4 core functions all legislatures perform. But there's a problem, and this is the big institutional dynamics. We tend to forget this. These core functions are inherently contradictory. No modern legislatures that we know of has ever resolved this contradiction because they pull the legislature as an organization, as a beast, as a creature, as in functions in all different directions. If you just take a look at the logic of these 4 functions. Having said that, what the legislature as a body consists of are functional fragmentation, diffusion, and specialization. So what legislatures exist in a state of permanent tension. And here is my punchline, folks. Legislatures are not efficient bodies. And my punchline is, if you're expecting legislatures to be efficient bodies, you will go to your grave a very miserable human being. Let me give you an example of the world's only legislature which passes laws substantive laws independent of the executive and independent of the people, and that is a US Congress. And we all know how efficient the US Congress is. The very fact US Congress passes a law is nothing short of a miracle. And you know why that's the case? You can thank my favorite political scientist, James Madison. He designed it this way. We can always have efficiency, but remember, Mussolini made the trains run on time. So whenever governments talk about efficiency, I get very nervous. Why is this the case? The way this is the case, good. This is my other diagram. The reason why this is the case is that the legislature is the only branch of government which sits at the intersection of a state and society. So as a result, it embodies, it represents, it exemplifies all the contradictions and all the tensions and all the controversies and all the acrimonies that exist in any human society, and particularly democracy, which the foundation, remember, the blood and soul that drives democracy is conflict. Not unanimity, not consensus, not nonpartisanship, not bipartisanship. It is conflict. So as a result, given where the legislature sits, you can see why the legislature is full of these contradictions and tensions performing these four different functions. When you're looking at the kinds of projects that you guys are working on, that Joseph and Carl have put together, you have an additional overhang here of the national government and the institutional legacy of authoritarianism. And that's why you see a lot of these tensions playing itself out in a wide variety of ways that you folks have captured in the individual paper. Okay, so what are the factors? And this comes straight out of our African Legislatures project. There are historical factors, institutional legacies. Let me give you one example of the legacies. One of the things we have noticed, and Bratton van der Waal pointed that out, authoritarian systems which had some reasonable elections in a single-party regimes tend to have successful democratic transitions. It's a very good historical fact, and where legislature sits in the historical dynamics and politics matters, because there is a learning curve going on. And one of the things we have learned that older legislatures in our project tend to be much more committed to institutional integrity about legislatures. This is what we have found by interviewing MPs. Constitutional design, we have already talked about. Whether it's a parliamentary system or a presidential system does matter in terms of how the legislature functions. Federal system, unitary system, we've already talked about. One of the things that is not in this project, and this is not a criticism because you guys just have to do so much, and we have done this. Internal rules and procedures are extremely important how legislatures work. And the reason why this set of things of operating budget, you need a professional staff, you need a committee system. Much of the nitty-gritty good work is done in legislatures. Let me give, for example, what we found in places like Tanzania and Uganda. You will go to the floor of the House, of the Parliament. Politicians are destroying each other rhetorically. But then we actually observe them operating in committees. They're actually horse trading. And at the end of the day, they go to the country club and get drunk because they're all friends. But they cannot do that in an open forum like the well of the House or well of the Senate because the leaders won't allow them. But get them behind in a committee system, they're really making policies. They're really horse trading. They're really compromising, which is what good democracy is all about. So you need impaired skills, norms, and attitudes. And in the African Legislatures project, we have an average of 50 legislatures we interviewed across 60 in South Africa, 60 in Nigeria, because they're bigger legislatures. That's how we know these things. One of the most important, larger issue, why this is important, it enables legislatures to create, sustain, and protect institutional autonomy and integrity. You can have all of these things, but if you don't have some of these internal procedures, it's very difficult to operate independently, particularly operating budget. Who controls the budget? There's a big debate in the last 5 or 6 years in many legislatures. Political factors, elections, electoral systems. Why this electoral system is important, this is one of the early work my colleagues and I had done. If you have a single member districts, you're going to have a very different pattern of representations. If you have multi-member districts, particularly proportional representation, you're going to have a completely different pattern of representation. So what kind of systems electoral systems you have does matter in terms of, in fact, where does it matter? It matters which of these things they're going to, MPs are going to stress. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, as Joseph pointed out, high rate of turnover in the Nigerian legislature. Extremely high rate of turnover in Zambia and Uganda and Malawi. Why? Younger MPs come in, bad experience with authoritarian rule. They want to engage in oversight. The problem is they're engaging in so much oversight, they don't have time to go back to their constituency in single-member districts. So when they go back during election time to their voters and say, hey, I'm back, vote for me, voters are saying, no, we won't. Where were you for the past 3 months? He said, well, we were doing oversight. We were keeping track of the president. He said, that's not your job. We sent you to bring home the pork, or in a Muslim country, bring home the chicken. Sound familiar? Well, that's what voters want. And we asked legislatures, of these four, which is most important? Personally, they would say oversight in lawmaking and representation. But then they asked them, which gives you most satisfaction? Constituency servicing. You ask the voters in a Africa public opinion poll, constituency servicing, voters place the highest, followed by representation. Oversight in lawmaking is yay high. Lesson to donors, folks, is stress capacity of lawmaking and oversight for legislators. You're not going to get long-term bang for the buck, because those people who are going to develop that capacity because of donor training, they're going to be kicked out in a democratic election. This is one of the lessons that we learned from our project. Now, then finally, public opinion matters. And we've already seen in some of the discourse analysis. And with that, I just want to, you can add all of this up, and I don't want to complicate matters as it is. This is what our framework looks like for African Legislatures project. This is overwhelming. All this does is create clusters of variables we have collected. We have collected variables on each of these clusters that you see for all 18 countries. Somewhere along the line, I'm hoping, my vision, an ideal vision is that you folks have established a baseline that you guys will be able to do this as part of this process. You don't have to do all of it, but at least some of it. With that, I promise you I will shut up and sit down. Thank you. I didn't go over.
Perfect. Now we will have our Q&A session. We have about 30 minutes, 29 minutes or so. We're stopping at noon. And I'll take the questions in clusters of 3. Please state your name, your affiliation, and ask a question. One of the things to set the stage for the Q&A portion, I think that for many of us, we think about democracies as being a platform for a range of things. One of the things that I always highlighted on the ground, particularly in Nigeria, that democracies are messy when I talked about democracies. They're not straight forms, and the importance of that messiness is the discourse that comes out of that, so that you are reflective. It provides freedom of association and freedom of speech. We talked a little bit about the transformation role that national and subnational legislatures have to play. And Professor Mosarfa talked about the fact that legislatures don't pass a lot of legislation. And I call that the transactional issue. What is a transactional issue that takes place to really help with the development on the ground? If you don't have legislation passing, are you really going to have social sector reform at the most base level? So I look forward to hearing the questions, setting the stage, and I'm hoping also that Professor Fashagba will talk a little bit about the oral derivation issue for Nigeria, because I think people should not walk away with the idea that each state gets the same amount of money from the oil derivation. They do not. So all states are not equally as rich. And then also on the taxation side, you have so many states in the north that have such a low tax base that tax collection is really, really a challenge. So with that, the floor is open. Again, questions of 3. Thank you. Okay, yes.
I wondered if you looked at the relationship. Can you hear me? I wondered if you looked at the relationship between countries that have a national chamber that represents the states, the state legislatures, such as in NCOP in South Africa, versus the other countries that I do not believe have such a structure.
Okay. Next, please identify yourself. Ma'am, could you please identify yourself?
Kathy Brennan-Wiggins, National Conference of State Legislatures.
Okay, thank you. The young lady in the blue.
Hi, my name is Erica Poff. I'm with the Center for International Private Enterprise. We're one of the core institutes of the NED. I want to push you a little bit more on this taxation issue. So at CIPE, we work with civil society mostly in the private sector. So we work with chambers and associations. And this issue of taxation is huge. Now, I'll relate it to our work in Nigeria. Most of the time, they're focused on engaging the government on multiple and illicit taxation. But in general, the idea of taxes is always we need less. We don't want to pay as much taxes, or we want to pay less taxes. Now, as democracy practitioners, we understand this bigger story that's being discussed, which is when you have taxation, you have more accountability, and that translates into better governance. But looking from the perspective of our partners, how do we sell this message that, no, you want to engage your state legislators, you want to engage your governors on taxation as we want to pay taxes, or we need to pay taxes, but, you know, in that way that gets away from the, well, that's taking money out of communities with very restricted income. So I just want your guys' opinion on that. And by the way, Dr. Fashagba, we work with the Coalition of Business and Professional Associations in Kwara who attend the landmark event. So I'd be interested if you have any specific advice on how you'd sell this message in Kwara. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last in the group of 3, yes, sir, in the front. Yes, right here. Yes. Mm-hmm.
My name is Charles, and I am a fellow with Search for Common Ground to the African team.
Okay.
I do appreciate the fact of decentralization of legislative powers, and also I like the fact that there is this autonomy that is being enjoyed by subnational legislative bodies. My concern is as regards to the state executive governance. How do we best check, and how do we put in place the ethical implications as regards to the autonomy which these state executives enjoy, with particular reference to some conflicts in Nigeria that have arisen on the grounds of, well, I don't want to use the term elite attitude, but on the grounds of, let's say, some mispresentations or misimplementation of some legislatures that are anti-nationalistic. I mean, I don't know if I'm right by using the term anti-nationalistic, but looking at the legislations on maybe Sharia and certain laws that tend to hinder appropriate expression of human rights, which is appropriate to the citizenry. So I wish to ask, how do we best check the ethical implications based on the grounds of this autonomy which state executives enjoy?
Thank you. Professor LeVan, I'd like you to answer the first question, Professor Fashagba the second question, and the third question, Professor Musafar, and then we'll end the third question also with a few comments because it's Nigeria focused with Professor Fashagba.
Okay. So, I mean, in response to Kathy Brennan-Wiggins' question, no, we didn't really explicitly look at that. I mean, one of the things that we had in mind in formulating different interactions of political institutions at different levels within any given country is to remedy what I see as a flaw within the federalism literature, which is that the federalism literature doesn't talk about political parties enough. And so I think it would be great if we had a little more information and maybe someone to do some research specifically on what you've outlined and maybe countries that would be similar to South Africa's structure. You would probably be one of my first resource people in exploring that. But I think what we wanted to do was to also think about the way the political system is integrated for better and for worse. So along the lines of what Professor Fashagba was talking about, where he was saying governors have a lot of control over who candidates are. And this, by the way, was a huge fight in the first 7 years of Nigeria under the Obasanjo administration, was who's going to control things, the ruling party, the PDP at the center, or the governors, or even the godfathers behind the governors. And I also just want to add something very quickly about one of the papers that I did not talk about because it speaks to Ambassador Sanders' questions about the oil revenue. And that is one of the papers that we commissioned is by Rotimi Suberu, who's a Nigerian professor at Bennington College in Vermont. And he's an expert on fiscal federalism. He knows the revenue allocation system in Nigeria better than anyone. And we asked him to write a chapter saying, what should Ghana and Tanzania and Sierra Leone not do? What are the key mistakes from Nigeria? And how might revenue allocation facilitate democracy and empower citizens from the ground up and that sort of thing? And I have one or two other comments, but I want to make sure we get the other questions answered.
This is the tax question.
Yeah.
The tax question, yes.
Yeah. I just want to start by telling you a brief personal experience. And around 2007, I'm living in Ilorin, Kwara State, in the North Central. Where I was living, I returned from office and saw a paper pasted on my wall to pay 10,000 naira as tenement rate. I removed the paper and I promised myself I was not going to pay a dime. You know why? The road I was plying to my house had damaged my exhaust pipe over and over again because erosion has washed the road away. So if you are not providing services with what you are getting and you want to tax me, I will not pay it. That is my position. And that is the mindset of an average Nigerian. If they are able to utilize what they are getting to provide services, I'm willing to pay. In my university, Carl was in my university, we enjoy 24-hour power supply. Outside of the university, they don't have 6 hours power supply. For the public, they pay 6 naira per unit. But because we are enjoying 24 hours, we pay 22 naira 50 kobo per unit. But we are happy to pay it. So services provided must commensurate with whatever you want to. It must commensurate with the tax we want to ask the people to pay. So in the absence of services provided by the state, it becomes difficult for individuals to be willing to part with their hard-earned money. That is the truth. That's about taxes. So if the civil society groups can advocate, work on the policymakers to be more responsible in terms of service provision, in terms of public goods delivery, I can assure everybody here that most Nigerian elite will be more than willing to pay. For example, the power sector has been privatized. We are all aware that tariff will go up, but let's make power available. Nobody will tell you it's not willing to pay. When you get power, for example, for 2 hours out of 24 hours a day, at the end of the day, they bring a bill of 4,000 to my house every month, and they tell you it is estimated, not the actual consumption. So they cheat the public, and if now that the thing has been privatized, the private investors are able to improve power provision, and as a result of that, raise the price per unit. I can assure you, everybody will be ready to pay. That's the truth. But when you are not providing services, it becomes difficult for somebody to part with its money unjustifiably. So the civil society groups will work on the state to be more responsible in terms of, for example, most of these politicians, they share the money. Instead of providing services, they share the money. In November, I'm so sorry about this, that I have to say this. A governor of a state, the civil servant have not been paid. He collected 200 million naira from the governor because he's the godfather, he installed the governor. 200 million naira, converted by 165 to $1, you get the rate. A governor collected it, while the civil servants in the state have not been paid. That money was enough to pave my road and so many other roads in my neighborhood. So if the civil society can work on the governors, on the policymakers, I can assure you that Nigerians are willing to pay tax.
Can I maybe add an addendum to that?
Yes, sure.
Yep.
Talk about strong executive also.
Oh, yeah. Why don't you do that one? And then I'll
about the strong executive, I think INEC has a role to play in checking the strong executive. We have laws on electoral financing. We have laws on electoral, but no politician in Nigeria complies with the law. No politician in Nigeria complies with the law. So if the civil society group can as well work on INEC to enforce and monitor the implementation of this law, the cost of election will come down. Because in Nigeria presently, election is an investment. Either you like it or not, it's an investment, highest bidder. You invest as much as possible, hoping that when you win, you recoup and make profit. So if INEC is able to control that, I can assure you that the governor, because most of the governors sponsor the legislators, and once you are sponsored, you have to dance to the tune of your sponsor when you emerge. So if INEC is able to work on that, that will reduce the cost. So an average individual will be able to afford to contest and fund his election without the money bags. That is that. Then that can be used to check the governor, the excesses of the governor on the state legislature. Their grip on the state legislature essentially is as a result of the finances they provide during electionary activities, campaign, and what have you. So if they are able to take care of this, then the political parties also, the amount they charge for nomination form is very high. The civil society can as well work on this to make the political parties to reduce it. If you give a form to somebody at 10,000, of course somebody like me will be able to 20 to 50,000. But if you are giving a form for 500,000, for heaven's sake, how many civil servants can afford that? The minimum wage in Nigeria is 18,000. A graduate, maybe a graduate in the service earns about 100,000. From the 100,000, he can hardly save 10,000 a month. And the cost of nomination form is 500,000. You have paved the way for the money bags. So all these things, INEC, the civil society maybe can work on INEC, the governors and things like that. Then there will be improvement.
Thank you. For anyone that doesn't know, INEC is the Independent National Election Commission in Nigeria, and they provide the overall legal framework for execution of the elections. Yeah. So just wanted to highlight that. And one point on that really is concern to me is for the 2015 election, they're going to have the presidential election first, followed by the governor's election. And so I'm worried about that because once the president is determined, then the freedom of individuals to feel like they're going to have the support to go forward to run for governor is going to be diminished. And it is a question I posed to the chairman when he was here, and it is something that I think we all need to be paying attention to, because the independence and the flow is really going to derive very differently if the president is chosen first and the governors are then followed, because the influencing will be quite high. Keeping on the same last comment by Professor Fashagba, we're going to turn to Professor Musafa to also talk a little bit about this strong executive and how you deal with it.
Yeah, I just want to pick up one question on the election side. This is some of the work we had done earlier, almost 10, 15 years ago. One of the universal phenomenon you see across the world, that every time there's a direct election of the executive presidency, the presidential party wins and dominates the legislative elections. If you flip it around, the two countries in Africa which does that, where the legislature precedes the presidential election, Benin and Madagascar, you see a very strong legislature. Madagascar has kind of dropped off the map from this, but Benin is
Zimbabwe did.
Oh, excuse me. Zimbabwe is exactly. Exactly. So they have changed the laws, and I think that's a very, very, very important point about presidential coattail. That's a universal phenomenon, and it has to do with how you design the electoral systems. But coming back to your executive authority, some of the specific that Joseph said is important. But let me just raise an issue. I forget the name of the author we were talking about in the car yesterday, Carl, on the subnational governance of Gibson's. There's a very nice book out on precisely the kind of issue you're talking about. And yes, executive authority in subnational governments tend to be somewhat centralized. But the question is, how do you expand? And the way to do that is precisely some of the things that Joseph talked about, but also increasing the capacity of the legislature to check and increasing various internal rules and procedures. And despite the fact that oftentimes MPs and parliamentarians don't like to engage in oversight functions, that needs to be mentioned. And could I just take a point about, you mentioned the Sharia law, and just let me mention something about the Sharia law, because one of my current project, as Carl knows, is on Islamic constitutionalism. So let me just tell you exactly about and I've done a number of all 56 Muslim countries. I'm comparing and Sharia law in Nigeria particularly. Yes, Nigeria has Sharia law, but it has not been implemented as much as you would think. There are countries which have very strong Sharia laws: Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia, Nigeria. They cannot get them implemented. You know why? Because the Central Supreme Court challenges them. So you got to be careful about how Sharia law is being designed, implemented, and that's why my favorite case we talk about Saudi Arabia is a Sharia law. Saudi Arabia sure has Sharia law, but guess what? Sharia law does not apply to international investment, banking, and commerce. And in fact, Saudi Arabia just changed its Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Commerce, where no longer you need religious education to be member of the ministry. You need to have Western legal education. So we need to be very careful and look at the variations across Muslim countries. Not all Muslim countries look alike. There's a tremendous variations, and that is the future of this kind of research. And Nigeria is one of the better examples of where local enclaves have been created because of the federal system for political and strategic reasons, but how far they're going to press remains an issue of constitutional deliberation, and increasing the power of the Central Supreme High Court is an extremely important case. Like I said, Turkey, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Nigeria are a very good example where Sharia law has not been implemented to the fullest extent as some of the supporters of Sharia law would like.
Thank you. I'm watching the time. I'm going to take two more questions from the floor, and when we turn to get answers, I'll turn to Professor LeVan first to say a little bit more on taxation that he wanted to mention. Two more questions from the floor. Yes, ma'am. Please identify yourself.
Julia Clonis, economist working on development and focusing on women and environment. My question has to do with one of my interests. In your deliberations and research, have you ever has anybody looked into the centralization versus decentralization from the gender perspective, because social and legal changes need to take place for more equality between the sexes. Thank you.
Thank you. One from this side, the gentleman with the hat.
Thank you, Madam. Just very quickly, on the Ethiopian issue and the larger African. On the Ethiopian issue, I found probably the analysis a little bit soft for good reasons. Probably, especially what we have at home is, by the way, I was a member of the parliament from 2005 to 2010. And the only time I used to attend was 5 times annually, because the only speaker of the parliament was the former prime minister. So even we, except him, we really did not have speakers or people who could speak as members of the parliament. I think from the analysis, I could not see the animal we have at home, what we call revolutionary democracy, which is the basis of all institutions, which is based on what we call democratic centralism, which allows fusion between party and the state, which also denies the existence of independent institutions, and so on and so forth. Therefore, no independent election board, no independent judiciary, no independent parliament, even the national parliament. And the animals at probably at the state levels, really they are creatures, taking orders from the center, not responding or having independent existence of their own. Therefore, that is why I say my colleague at home is a little bit soft in the analysis. The larger African one.
One question is that you want somebody to address that analysis a little bit more? Okay.
In fact, at the larger African level, in much of Africa, the legislatures are really not totally controlled in most cases, except probably a few South Africa, Ghana, Botswana, or a few areas.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Now, very quickly, really, that is why the cynicism at home is the Nepal they are trying to do change at African Union level. We say it as the Nepalese never expect popular African democracy.
Thank you very much.
We're at that level.
We're going to try to squeeze in one more from the back. I saw one hand in the back. Yes, sir. Yes, you. Mm-hmm.
My name is Chukwuma Onya Godwin from GMU. Okay, my question is this. If you take American Constitution, when you open it, the first thing you see is we the people. When you take Constitution of Nigeria, for example, even though it says we the people, Nigerian Constitution of 1999, it's obvious that the Constitution did not come out of the people. And so it has an implication. For example,
your question?
My question is, currently Nigeria is having a constitutional conference, and majority of the stakeholders, especially the opposition party, are boycotting it. My question is, how would the current Nigerian constitution sustain or improve relationship between the legislatures, the executive, both at the same level and also same time with the people? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have questions for. First, I'm going to turn to Professor LeVan to say something briefly that he wanted to add on taxes, and then address the question of state constitutions.
Yeah, I'll be efficient and say a couple of things. The Center for International Private Enterprise partners were actually at the seminar at Landmark University. So to the question of how do you encourage working people and small businesses to actually pay taxes, you know, they told very interesting stories about very particular incidents that had to do with the taxing of vans that were providing public transportation. And I think what that incident illustrated for us in a larger sense at the conference was that that the tax was coming down from above rather than asking people, what services do you want that you are willing to pay for? So that's one thing. Two, we're going to have great data on people's willingness to pay in a few weeks from the Afrobarometer Round 5 survey, which is focused on taxation. So we'll have nice complementarity, I think, between Elemo's research, and she interviewed over 100 state-level legislators for her paper, about the attitude of elites where the level of taxation varies. In Nigeria, those three key states are Kano, Lagos, and Sokoto. And in Lagos, the level of taxation has dramatically gone up. And it's gone up because people have become willing to pay.
Because they're getting services.
Because they're getting services.
Right.
The trash is getting cleaned up, the roads are getting cleared, the traffic is down, bridges are getting repaired, and so forth and so on. And there's some political motivations for making that happen. So the question is, how do you replicate those political motivations for making that happen, maybe at a more local level?
The second question was on women's role in decentralization.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure we know. I think it's maybe a little bit too early to know. There is a new, really valuable emphasis in the political science literature about women in legislatures, comparatively. Comparative Political Studies, the journal, just published a whole special issue on that topic. One of the things to emerge from that, for example, is that women who serve under quotas, as in Uganda, are treated differently and have less power than women who are popularly elected, not through quotas. And so, you know, this even came up at the presentation at American University last night, was how do we get more women in the legislatures, and is this a good thing, or are we making assumptions about women's preferences being different? And that was not entirely clear. You know, and on Ethiopia, I don't think he's being too soft on Ethiopia. I mean, if you read the paper, it's pretty tough on the government of Ethiopia. But I think what he's trying to say is that there's this invisible source of control that we don't even really notice that is the basis of authoritarianism here. And so he's trying to say something a little bit different from the sort of standard analyses about Ethiopia's politics.
Okay, thank you. I think it'll be interesting to also know how many women legislators were interviewed by the research team, and I think that would be an interesting thing to know as well. I'm going to turn to Professor Mosafar to talk a little bit about the current improvement of the executive and how they would work together with the legislators.
Two very quick points on women. We interviewed women, female legislators, and I interviewed a bunch of them in Uganda, and Carl is absolutely right. Our data show very clearly those folks who were women who were recruited on affirmative action, President Museveni's. We have a classification of MPs into different categories, and one of the categories is party hacks. Most women we have classified into party hacks. Our data showed that, and people got very angry at us when we presented that to World Bank. On the other hand, if you talk to women who are elected, in fact, we interviewed them, they had nothing nice to say about the people who were elected on quota system. So we got to be careful. There is a big constraint on women and younger recruits coming into the legislature. You know what it is? This is the underside of economic successful growth. If the private sectors are doing well, people are making money, why would you want to go into politics? This is phenomena we are actually beginning to see, and nobody has tapped that in sub-Saharan Africa. Coming back to your point about constitutions, I just want to say a couple of things. I am, for those people who know me, I tend to be a big fan of James Madison. I would like to caution you about using the American constitutional process as an example. James Madison will never agree with you. In fact, none of the 55 men who wrote the Constitution will ever agree with you that people should be involved in the Constitution. In fact, that whole 10 weeks of Constitutional Convention was made in secret. Early on, in the first couple of days, they took a vote in the Constitutional Convention to have secret session. So I just want to raise that issue. And having said that, I also would like to point out there are a couple of very good research projects, in fact, including the gentleman I talked to, a dissertation with one of Carl's department at American University. He's doing a wonderful study on popular participation in constitution making. And some preliminary results that we have seen is very mixed. So we need to be very careful at what stage, and the stages is initiation, formulation, and referendum. Widespread use of popular participation in referendum. Less so in the early stages and the middle stages. And our historical data show from a wide range of different time periods and different countries, popular masses participation don't always work out in producing what you and I would normally consider to be good, sustainable country. In this day and age of populist democracy, that's a very controversial fact to remain, but there are very serious collective action problems, political problems. All you have to do is take a look what happened in the Mali and the Benin National Conference in the early 90s, where they had to design decision-making rules to control the massive amount of input they got and the membership they got from civil society groups. It's a very controversial issue. I realize that, but one of the message I thought I was trying to convey is to lower our expectations about what democracy can and cannot produce. We need to be a lot more feasible rather than desirable in our criteria to look for democratic outcomes. And the reason I'm saying that, as Carl pointed out, the Afrobarometer survey is telling us that, and this gets back to the taxation, I just cannot help, but we have surveys to show, and World Bank found that out in the 1990s. Folks in Africa and Latin America, rural areas, were willing to pay user fees because it is empowering. That's what user fees do, and what, in a democratic context, what taxation does. And anybody ought to know that. We Americans ought to know that. Remember, no taxation without representation. That's what democracy ultimately is all about. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's a great note to close out our session. Certainly, it's been enlightening looking at what subnational legislatures should do, what are the challenges, and where donors and research need to be further highlighted. I want to say something just quickly on Lagos and taxation. I'd add to the North, Katsina as another model state on how resources are really used quite well in terms of taxation. And I think that we need to look at all of these issues. We look forward to the research, to the volumes coming out. I think it's been an enlightening session. I want to thank our esteemed panelists, and also I would like to thank all of you for being with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to meet you.